As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Jesus took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. After the Sabbath, at dawn, on the 1st day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the woman hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day.
Thanks, Maurice. We're going to narrow down now into the bit we're going to look at this morning and to think about, and just note some details, and then we'll sing, and then we'll have a think about what we've got to learn from it. So we've seen that Jesus has died on the cross. He was buried by his friends in Joseph's tomb. It's now the day after preparation day that Maury was trying to get right there. It's a bit of a strange phrase, isn't it? It's actually the Sabbath. Why doesn't Matthew make that clear? Well, at a festival time, there might be more than one Sabbath within the festival week, and so it's probably just trying to identify that this is the Saturday now, the day after the preparation day, and the religious leaders are concerned. They're worried. You would think they would have been rejoicing. They've got rid of Jesus, this nuisance, this person who's been stealing their thunder and getting in the way of what they want to do and challenging their authority, but they are worried, and they go to Pilate. And they say to Pilate, there's a rumor from Jesus' teaching that he would rise again on the 3rd day, and we want to make sure there's no chance of that rumor persisting, and we want to make sure that the body does not leave the tomb. We don't want the disciples nicking the body and claiming that he has risen as he said. We're not happy that this might happen, and so they go to Pilate on the Sabbath, which is their religious day, which raises a few questions about what they should be doing and why they're doing this. And it's a reminder again that they don't have authority. They've got to ask the Romans if they're going to post a guard, but still, they're so determined to stop the news of Jesus spreading. And they want this, not just him dead, but his memory and anything associated with him finished and over. And so they ask Pilate for permission to seal the tomb, which he grants. And then they go and take a guard, and they put a seal on the tomb. we often think about something being sealed as in inaccessible. You can't get in. Well, in a sense, the stone made it pretty difficult to get in, and the guard made it even more difficult to get in. But the seal was not to stop you getting in. It was to show whether it's been tampered with. So it's I don't know if, I just think about this morning. I don't know if they still do them. You know when you got a jam pot and the little button pops up? Are they still on those? I can't remember. I never opened the jam in our house. But it was to show that no one's been tampering with the jam. No one's been into the jam before you. And that was the idea with this seal. Probably a cord sealed with a wax seal with the stamp of the authority to show that no one's been tampering. And the seal was probably there to keep the guards honest. The Jewish leaders would know whether the guards have been bribed if the seal has been broken. So all these efforts to try and make sure that no one tampers with the tomb, that no one gets hold of the body and pretends that Jesus has come back to life, to make sure that Jesus really is dead and buried and his memory is no more. All those efforts to make sure it stops there and then. Well, what can we learn from that? We'll have a think about that in a few moments' time, but we're going to sing first the song "Low in the Grave He Lay," which has got the wonderful line in one of the verses, "Vainly they seal the dead." All these efforts to try and keep that stone rolled closed, the seal and the guards and everything else, and it's all in vain because Jesus rose again. So let's stand and sing "Low in the Grave He Lay" before we return to our passage to see what we can learn from it this morning. Truly great hymn. I remember as a child listening to that being sung in church and longing for the day when I could have a deep enough voice to really sing out that wonderful chorus, "Up from the grave he arose," that tremendous sense of excitement and joy. Well, let's come back to our passage and have a think about what we can learn from it for us this morning. This God at the tomb. And I want you to notice firstly that the big emphasis in the passage is the security of the tomb. The word secure is mentioned 3 times in verses 62 to 66. It's the obsession of the religious leaders that they want this tomb secure. And so they go asking, verse 64, for the tomb to be made secure. Then permission in verse 65 is given for the tomb to be made secure. And then in verse 66 it tells us how the tomb was made secure. Secure, secure, secure. Here's the obsession. We want that stone in place. We don't want anyone messing with the body, anyone tampering with the evidence. We want Jesus dead and buried. We want Jesus out of the way. Can you see in verse 63 we're told that we remember that while he was still alive. They are convinced that Jesus is dead. There's no doubt about that. They've seen him hanging on the cross. They've heard him cry his last. They've watched his lifeless body be taken down. They are sure that Jesus is dead. But they're still worried. Worried about a rumor. So they want the dead body placed in a secure tomb. They don't want anyone messing. They don't want it touched. They want Jesus locked away, forgotten forever. So it's all about the security of the tomb. But why? Well, the secure tomb was to prevent deception. But it didn't, as we'll see in a moment. The religious leaders were really concerned because Jesus had been telling his disciples that he would die and then rise again on the 3rd day. We're not sure how they've come to know that, because when Matthew records it in chapter 16 verse 21 and Matthew 17 verse 23 and chapter 20 verse 19, he's speaking to his disciples. Has the news spread to around the crowds as people have been thinking? Did Judas, when he betrayed Jesus, share something of this? We don't know, but the religious leaders have come to hear this. Jesus, before he died, told people that he would die and then rise again. And that information is circulating. And the religious leaders are frightened. They're not frightened of Jesus coming back to life because dead people stay dead. That's obvious. It always happens. There's been no exceptions. So we can rest secure in that bit. But they are concerned that the disciples are going to make the most of that prediction and steal the body. They're concerned that the disciples are going to steal the body and go, hey, empty tomb, Jesus is alive. What he said was true. And so the religious leaders say that this deception would be worse than the first. It might be that the Jewish leaders have become more concerned because they've lost control of the body. They were so pleased to have secured Jesus' sentence, so pleased to have secured his death. He's being put to death on the cross, and they've watched him die. But then things have moved quite quickly, as Joseph of Arimathea has gone to see Pilate and asks for the body, and then comes and takes the body, presumably with Pilate's permission, maybe with some soldiers with them, and takes the body down and puts it in the tomb. And suddenly the Jewish leaders have got no control over this situation, and they're nervous now. It might be why they've come on the Sabbath, because they would have normally tried to avoid anything like this on the Sabbath. Explains perhaps why there's a delay in posting the guard, that it's the following day that they get the guard on. Someone could have nicked the body already, to be honest, but clearly it's not the case. The stone's there. And so they go to Pilate with this concern. They're convinced that Jesus has been a deceiver all along, that he's been lying about who he is, that his first deception about being the Messiah, right, coming from God, coming with God's authority, they're convinced all that's wrong. And now they're concerned the last deception will be even worse, that his disciples will somehow pull this ultimate stunt of stealing the body and pretending that Jesus is alive. And in their minds, this is quite interesting, isn't it? In their minds, the rumor, the tale, the story of a risen Jesus come out of the grave is a worse thing than the living Jesus performing miracles in their midst. They're more worried about a story of his resurrection than they were about his life and his power in their midst. They're aware, they know the power of myth and legend. They know just this could be the end of their authority if this story gets out, because actually it's much more difficult to contain and control. They feel as though they've done a good job of that with Jesus. And they really cannot afford for this to happen. They're determined that there will be no deception, that the dead Jesus stays dead, that the facts are there for everybody to see. He's in the tomb, it's sealed, and therefore they can draw a line under this terrible incident, this awkward character, this nuisance who's upset the status quo, this Jesus. Now, it's worth saying here, isn't it, that the desire to remove deception, the desire to prevent deception, is an entirely commendable thing. Actually, Jesus, back in Matthew 24, had warned his disciples of the danger of being deceived. People claiming all sorts of things. People claiming to be the Messiah. False messiahs, false prophets, performing great signs to deceive, even if possible, the elect. Jesus warns his disciples that there will be deception out there. There will be all sorts of false claims. And for the last 2,000 years, those sorts of things have gone on. There are many claims of the miraculous, spectacular things that are supposed to have happened, which actually are silly and fallacious and incredible, and yet have gained great followings. And Jesus calls us as disciples not to be gullible, naive, believing everything. Paul writes in the New Testament, test the spirits. Jesus says, don't be deceived. He wants us to have our brains switched on. He wants us to use our eyes and our ears. He wants us to think about what we're seeing. We're not to be deceived by fake stories. It's even more difficult, isn't it, now with the internet and videos and all sorts of other things, and all the conspiracy theories, and did they really land on the moon, and who did shoot JFK, and all those sorts of things. Wow, it's so easy to be drawn into these stories, and we've got to really think carefully. Jesus calls us to do that, not to be deceived. It's a good thing to try and prevent deception. At that level, there's nothing wrong with what's going on here. The tragedy of this story is that these religious leaders who set out to stop deception, in the end, perpetrate it. They wanted this tomb sealed and the guard there to make sure that the disciples couldn't steal the body and say that he was alive. They were determined to prevent deception. But in the bit that Mari also read in 28 verses 11 to 15, when Jesus does rise and the body isn't there, they end up paying the soldiers to spread the lie that the disciples did nick the body. People who are so hot on anti-deception become the deceivers themselves. Tragically, that's not an uncommon journey. For people who are champions of truth to become deceivers to champion their truth. So much is at stake, we'll end up twisting things to serve our own ends. It's something we have to be very careful with ourselves. Even the law sometimes struggles with this, doesn't it? When you're trying to catch a cheating the system, you do a sting. You create a fake scenario to catch the people who are creating fake scenarios to gain for themselves. And then there's all sorts of questions like, is this right? And should we do this? Because you're trying to defend the truth. You end up manipulating, changing, challenging things. And these religious leaders who wanted to make sure that there was no funny goings on with the body end up become deceivers themselves. And in fact, their own last deception is worse than their first. All the way through, Jesus has been showing himself to be God by the miraculous signs, by the words he's been teaching, from the scriptures. The religious leaders have been opposing it and trying to turn people, and they eventually did. Crucify him, the crowds cried. And now their worst deception, he's really dead. He's not alive at all. The anti-deceivers become the deceivers. Folks, let's not be deceived. Let's check out the evidence. Let's have our brains switched on. Let's examine what's happening. Let's think. Let's be careful that we're not drifting into deceiving others, hiding things to get our story out. Even as Christians, we can be in danger of that. The secure tomb was to prevent deception, but it didn't. And actually, it points to the reliability of the resurrection accounts. The bottom line is this: historians have pretty much generally agreed that the tomb was empty on the third day. There's not a lot of controversy about that. The tomb where Jesus was laid was empty. There's consensus on that. The big question is, how? How did the tomb of Jesus become empty? What did happen to the body? That's the big question. And the Jewish leaders here, in their determined opposition to the Jesus movement and to the story of Jesus and to the reality of resurrection, actually lay down one more piece of evidence for its reliability. All their efforts to secure the tomb, to have the guard, to have the seal, to show that the disciples hadn't stolen the body, shows that the disciples didn't steal the body. And so we have to cross off that possibility. There wasn't fraud here. There wasn't deception. It wasn't possible for the disciples to nick the body. So what did happen to the body of Jesus? Why was the tomb empty? Well, of course, it could have been the wrong tomb. They went to the wrong address. But no, because Joseph of Arimathea laid him in his own tomb, his own new tomb, where there were no other bodies laid, and the women had gone and watched him be buried there. They knew the tomb. The guards knew the tomb. They were posted on it. If there was any tomb that was definitely known at the time as to which tomb Jesus had been laid in, it was that one. Everything pointed to it. It's where all the activity was happening. Couldn't have been the wrong tomb. Well, maybe, of course, Jesus could have not really died, just sort of fainted and passed out and then revived. Well, he'd been beaten to near death. He couldn't carry the cross post himself. Someone else, Simon of Cyrene, had to carry that. They'd watched him die. The other Gospels talk about Pilate checking he's dead and the spear being thrust in his side. And folks, even if he had revived in the cool of the tomb, as one of the theories goes, there's no way that weak and beaten and near-dead Jesus would have got up and rolled the stone away and overcome the guard. No, the Jewish leaders themselves in this passage make it clear that he was alive, but he is dead. The more I spend time in the gospel accounts and read what's going on, the more certain I become that the reason the tomb was empty is Jesus came back to life. It's the only theory that satisfies the evidence. Many people have set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus, and when looking at the actual facts, come to faith, come to believe that this is true, that it does stack up. But why does it matter? Why is this important? Why does Matthew record this incident of the Jewish leaders sealing the tomb and trying to make it secure? Why does he then record how they paid the soldiers to lie? Actually, that lie amongst the Jewish community persisted certainly into the mid-100s. Justin Martyr, writing later, is having to deal with the same rumour. Why is it so important? Well, let's think about it this way. The more crucial something is, the more certain you need to be about it. I hate to tell you that we have not risk assessed the chairs that you're sitting on this morning. We have not, in the past week, gone round and put weights on all of them to make sure that they'll sustain your weight. We haven't bothered. That's really careless of us. I'm very sorry. The next time you're on a plane, if the pilot says we haven't tested anything in the last week or so, and we've done no risk assessment, I suggest you get off pretty quickly. The reality is with the chairs, hopefully they'll be all right, and if the worst comes to the worst and you do slip off, it's not too far to the ground. But if you're thousands of meters up in the air and the plane's not airworthy, you're in serious trouble. The more important the matter is, the more thorough you need to be, the more certain you need to be. And when it comes to life and death and eternity, what happens after we die? Do we continue to exist beyond the grave? This is absolutely vital, because the Bible says eternity stretches on forever, and there's only two destinations. Death is not the end, says the Bible. You and I will continue to exist forever, and there's only two destinations. Either to be with God, as we saw in the children's video, in the new creation, in a place where there's no more bad and no more sad, really joyful, or to be shut out in the darkness, which is what we all deserve. There are only those two destinations. And what changes us from heading to the destination we deserve is the good news of Jesus, when we put our trust in him, because he died to welcome us in. That's what the Bible teaches about life and death. Now, if that's true, we need to be sure. We need to be definite about the evidence. And so there's evidence for the resurrection. I heard someone saying recently that, well, you Christians believe these things because of your book, and then the Muslims believe something because of their book, and the other people believe something because of their book. But we need to say, look, folks, all books are not the same. When someone has dreams and writes down what they think and puts it out, you can't test whether they really did have a dream or whether God was really speaking to them. You have to accept their word for it. But when a holy book says, in history, this happened, you can test it. You can check it out. You can look at the evidence to see whether it's credible or not. The Bible is the only one of the religious books that's testable historically. Tragically, people mock it without ever investigating. I had a friend at school who was convinced there was an old bloke hiding around the corner laughing at all these Christians believing the Bible that he wrote. Well, he must have been a very old bloke, because the last bit of the Bible was written at the end of the first century. He must have been at least 1900 years old. That would have been a real spectacle to examine. But my friend was convinced of that. But he'd never tested the evidence. He'd never checked it out. He never thought about the facts. And sadly, I take a lot of funerals. And when it comes to death, people believe all sorts of things. It's funny that when we live life, we want facts and certainty. When it comes to death, we leap into realms of fantasy without any certainty at all. And so there are the poems about people always being with us, or joining the stars in the sky, or looking down on us, or you refer to the dead person gone to be with. But on what basis? How have you decided that? Something that's so important, so painful, so vital, so forever. Why would you rest on vague poems and wishful thinking? I have a friend who's sitting with his mum at the moment dying. Neither of them believers. What hope is there? And he's posting about wishful things and hope. But on what basis? Why would you put yourself in that situation of being uncertain about the most important thing that will ever happen to you? Passing into eternity. Folks, when it comes to death, we cannot rely on fairy tales and myths. But so many do. The Bible, you see, invites us to trust in something that's sure and certain, not made up and fanciful. The Jewish leaders tried to prevent deception. They did, in a sense. The disciples couldn't have stolen the body. The reality was the disciples weren't even thinking about stealing the body. They'd all done a runner. They were convinced game was up. It was over. They were in mourning. They were probably disgusted with themselves. They were disappointed in Jesus. They were confused. They weren't in any shape to organize a raid on the tomb and pretend that Jesus was still alive. But actually, their Jewish leaders' desire to ensure that no one could tamper with the tomb is just another piece of the evidence to show that Jesus really did rise again. And so we can be certain about what happens after death and matters of eternity, because we know the one person who themselves have been to the other side and come back, who's controlled death and resurrection. We can trust his word. So the secure tomb was to prevent deception, but didn't, and points to the reliability of the resurrection accounts, and also points to the unstoppable nature of the resurrection. We're going to get to this in 2 weeks' time, but all of this sets us up for that very first Sunday, doesn't it? When we see that neither death, nor the stone, nor the seal, nor the guard could contain Jesus. The sealing of the stone and the placing of the armed guard just add to the dramatic triumph of Jesus' resurrection. Whatever the Jewish leaders did to try and eradicate Jesus from the scene was totally pathetic in the power of the resurrection. In earthly terms, the Jewish leaders held all the cards. The body was dead. They had the authorities on their side, the power of the day, the Roman Empire with the Roman soldiers, the best in the world, guarding the tomb. They had the seal of the Roman governor on the tomb. All the earthly cards of power in their hands. But it couldn't contain the Son of God. on the next day. All their efforts to eliminate Jesus, the Messiah, from the stage of history are held up for derision in the irresistible triumph of the resurrection. The psalmist in Psalm 2 says, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Why are people so desperate to disprove God and to eradicate him from the world with all their efforts and all their inventions and all their intuitions and all their cleverness and all their precautions? The God in heaven, we're told in that psalm, sits and laughs because he is God. And as these religious leaders desperately try and contain the body in the tomb, the next day as the tomb is empty and the stone is rolled away and the seal is irrelevant and the guards are trembling and now lying, it all points us to the unstoppable nature of the resurrection of Jesus. It's sure. It's certain. It brings life. It brings hope. Folks, you can sit with a loved one who is passing into eternity, with all the unpleasantness and horror of the physical decay, in sure and certain hope of their future because of what Jesus Christ has done in rising from the dead. People this weekend will be gambling on all sorts of things in life, whether it's for sport, putting money on a sporting bet, or taking risks. Folks, there's only one certain winner in the history of our world. Heaven and earth will pass away, says the Bible, but not God's words. Jesus is risen. Death is not the end. And for all who are trusting in him, there is life eternal with God, with nothing sad or with nothing bad. And we can be sure. If you've never investigated the evidence, please look carefully. Please study it. Please find that assurance for yourself in the risen Lord Jesus, who you can know for yourself. And if you receive that assurance, if you know this truth, let's make it known to others. This greatest of all hopes for a lost and broken world. There are a couple of books in the resources room as you go through the door right in front of you. Val Grieve is a Christian lawyer from Manchester. Actually, David and Anne knew him. Has written Your Verdict on the Empty Tomb. As a lawyer, he's used to working out what's credible in court. What would stand up in court? What's credible evidence? How can we know anything? And very helpful, he goes through the resurrection and thinks about the empty tomb and where we might go. There's another book by John Blanchard, Why Believe the Bible? Again, this book is testable. We can be certain. Maybe as a Christian, you're finding it difficult, people laughing, not sure whether you should believe it. I'll read one of those, just gain some certainty. Maybe you're not yet a believer. You want to know, borrow one of those. Have a read, have a think. But folks, this is vitally important. We need to get this right because it affects where we end up for eternity.